Hello everybody, welcome to Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about Autechre and their fifth LP, LP5. Alright then, we made it to the last 90s Autechre album, another big turning point in their career as they continue to transition into the weirder and more abstract ideas that would characterize their work after this, and they stopped relying on formulas and sounds that were more characteristic of the decade they broke out in, showing them finally settling on a sound that fit them and couldn't be mistaken for anyone else. Even more so than on Chiastic Slide. I mean, even though everyone calls this project LP5, technically it's self-titled. The cover just has their name on it and that's it. And in a lot of ways, that's still kind of fitting. It kind of demonstrates what this duo is all about in a fairly succinct way. It showcases a lot of the sounds that I can only associate with them. It's almost like a new beginning for them. Now there's my personal connection with this project, and on one hand, I think I would be lying if I said I held this project particularly close to me, or it has any kind of nostalgia factor or something like that. Honestly, I almost never put this one on unless I've been trying to marathon the rest of their albums. I remember first hearing it during a run of catching up on their stuff when I was just starting out college, and it left no impression on me whatsoever at the time. I was quite bored by it, and as seems to be the usual case with their stuff, while I found it to be impressive on a technical level, it didn't resonate with me emotionally much at all. That said, this was really only the case on my earliest run-throughs with the album. When I revisited it while preparing for my infamous LSEC review, it clicked with me a lot more strongly than I expected, and every subsequent revisit I gave it continually held up for me. It's kind of weird, like, I went back and forth on whether I properly consider this project great and one of their best, or if it's just good and just a hair short of greatness. Whenever I put it on, there's really nothing I can point to when it comes to, like, the specific details that really bothers me. It's well-paced and varied. All these tracks still have coherent melodies and rhythms, even if on the more abstract side than before. I hesitate to say it's accessible because it did need some time to grow on me, but it does still have some accessibility. It doesn't run on too long or finish too quickly. I had a very hard time deciding on a least favorite track because whenever I single one out, the next listen I pay attention to it, it turns out better than I thought it did. Every track here is at least good. This whole thing is undoubtedly better than Chiastic Slide for me. But the one hang-up I have with it is that's been so hard to get over is, just like with Chiastic Slide, this project disappears from my head very quickly. The whole thing is rather ephemeral, it doesn't stick with me in the long term. After the project finishes, I can kind of recall the general outline of how it plays out. I can remember some of the melodies from Acro Year 2, and if I've just finished it, then maybe some of those trumpet licks from Drain 2, and that's about it. I mean, it is basically the only issue I have with the album, but it is a very big one and not an ignorable one. Also the production, like in general, it can feel pretty thin and tinny. They've had other projects that just hit harder, feel like they leave more of a stronger impact. I don't know, I'm kind of conflicted on it, but I guess I can lean into the things I actually like about it. Going into individual tracks, I'm likely to be a lot more positive on it in general. I mean, the project most definitely starts out with a bang. The opener, Acro Year 2, may very well be the single strongest opening track to any Autechre album. Just hitting you right away with some of the most frantic and mind-bending sets of percussive rhythms that you've ever heard. Moving at like 200 miles an hour while these little wheezing melodies just barely poke out over the top. Those notes. And some kind of thin, hollowed-out bass lines to help provide some more groove is the kind of track that will get your head nodding at the fastest possible pace that doesn't result in you throwing your neck out. The track also runs for 8.5 minutes and has a few progressions with other melodies and textures getting the chance to take more of a focus. It just has so much going on, but it never at any point feels overbearing or unwelcoming. It's an excellent way to start out this project and hook you in right away. Going on from there, you got 777, which isn't one of the biggest high points for me, but it is definitely a banger. Its clanking percussion patterns moving at a slightly different pace from that big thudding, omnipresent kick drum It makes it very easy to make out the tempo of the track and where the pulse is, though it's much harder to tell what the time signature is supposed to be. It has some like organ-like synth cores that kind of squirt out at the top too, and a couple of subtle pads and high-pitched ringing sounds. It almost feels like all these rhythms are coming together at complete random, but there's still an undeniable pulse to the whole thing that still gets my foot tapping. I think the following track, Ray, does something kinda similar but even stronger. It moves at the exact same pace and tempo, it segues relatively smoothly. Although here the 4/4 time is easier to wrap your head around, the drums themselves have a lot more body and weight to them, more like a hip-hop beat. I feel like all the percussion hits hard rather than the previous track where just the kick drum drove everything. There's also more change-ups, like there's a fake out 3 minutes in where the drums sound like they're slowing down and having their tempo but just kind of fall into some different textured rhythms instead without the tempo changing. And across the whole track, the melodic progressions are much more present, much warmer and more comforting. It's really freaking nice. Speaking of present melodies, we next have a short interlude in Melv. Ordinarily, when I see a track that's just barely over a minute surrounded by lots of other tracks that have much meatier lengths like these, that I tend to want to pick the short interludes as the least favorites. But I can't do that for Melv because it's almost certainly the most accessible and melody-centric track in the bunch. Just a bunch of plinking bell sounds that sound like they just came out of the Super Mario 64 soundtrack. Like, you know that song that plays when you're next to, like, the sleeping piranha plant? Imagine that, but, like, a little creepier. That's Melv. Next is Vos In, another point that I guess is another lower tier one for me. The melodies are still right at the forefront, while the percussion clanking and buzzing happens a little more in the background, although the melodies themselves have a much more disorienting quality to them that I'm not always in the mood for. It can be kinda off-putting. Though this track also has the last 2 minutes or so where it feels like just the whole mix just suddenly falls apart and collapses into an incoherent heap. Like it just goes off the chain and just flies through a bunch of weird noises out of nowhere, and you know, that's certainly a memorable way for that track to go out. And after this, the project really picks up even more with 2 of its best tracks. Fold 4 Rap 5 is a warm and optimistic track with layers of guitar-like synth leads and enveloping pads, and percussion textures that sound like they're constantly slowing down. Like they're prevented from losing its grooves because the rhythms go into double time every few seconds in a way that's almost completely unnoticeable. It feels like one of those zoom in on a fractal things with the percussion there. It's just such a cool and unique idea for a track here. And it's immediately followed up with Under BOAC, which is another big standout from this thing, with all these hollowed out rhythms that sound like you took a bunch of those like giant cylindrical garbage cans you see in parks, turn them upside down, and then just use them as drums and we're banging on them like that with wooden spoons and shit. They hit super hard and in a really memorable way too. You can also hear some weird garbled voice snippets wind their way through the wiry melodic pads in the first half. I guess it's this woman speaking in English, but she's near incomprehensible thanks to all the filtering effects. The only words I could make out were a very brief moment where she says, "Is it washable?" Oh yeah, and this track's a two-parter as well. Like halfway through, the melodies switch over into some more menacing territory, and the drums get a little more frantic and more complex, even if not actually faster than they were going before. Yeah, that whole track's great. After this, we get Cork, which is a more muted and low-key moment on here. The melodies and percussion are a lot more sparse, even though not without a solid pulse that eventually feels like slapping a big empty plastic toy box. The whole thing feels kinda dull and dreary and fitting for like a day with overcast skies. It's the one I arbitrarily picked as my non-cop-out least favorite for the description, though I don't know, it's not the kind of track that I just feel nothing when I put on. It's still pretty good, I don't skip it either. It's kind of effective in its dreariness, it's cool. Then we got another short interlude, Caliper Remote, which has all these plinking, pitched metallic sounds and plastic clattering, like the percussion sounds like if you stuffed a ping pong ball in a bottle and then shook it around. And there's some high-pitched melodic fragments on top too that have a little bit of a Boards of Canada vibe to them. Short, but oddly refreshing to have around. And now we move on to the album's closing moments. Arch Carrier is a highly tense and anxious track with lots of thin and springing melodies plucking away, but eventually building up these orchestral pads behind them. It's pretty awesome, and for whatever reason there's a few quick moments where those orchestral pads kind of remind me a little of Gangsta's Paradise. I don't know. I don't mind that, though. It's still some nice dark and dramatic stuff, almost even bordering on epic. Could get there if the synth tones and percussion weren't so thin and fragmented and the strings weren't totally abandoned partway through, but whatever. Definitely one of the bigger personal highlights either way. But finally, we make it to the album's grand finale, the 9.5-minute triumphant fanfare that is Drain 2. This track has layers of warm pads, a trumpet-like lead synth that sounds out over the whole mix, and the percussion itself sounds like it has a pitch and a bass line, and has rhythms that sound like they're bouncing like super balls. I mean, fun fact that this track was half done as a response to Aphex Twin's Bucephalus Bouncing Ball, which kind of uses the same bouncing rhythms. And that track itself was a response to Autechre's earlier track just called Drain. Drain 2 is probably the best in this mini IDM tennis match. It may even be the best track on the album. Like, it certainly justifies its length, the way it progresses from its rhythms just bouncing around at random to eventually forming a bouncy and infectious pulse about 5 minutes in, and then building on top of itself in a really satisfying way. The mix just becomes richer and more impressive as it goes on, but then slowly bleeds away and gives way to these more delicate and glassier melodic tones at the very end. It's freaking great. I mean, if I do have my problems with this track, is that it unfortunately comes from the era of hidden tracks on CDs. And what should be a track marked as 9 minutes and 38 seconds instead looks like it's 23 minutes and 19 seconds. Monsters, Inc. reference goes here. But yeah, 12 of those 23 minutes are just silence, and the last minute and 40 seconds are a really underwhelming hidden track that's just some atonal squirting noises, and it's barely a track at all. If I'm counting that hidden track in the proper track listing, then that is the least favorite by a long shot. It's just something put there for the sake of following the hidden track gimmick that lots of other people did, and it turns this track, which would have been perfectly satisfying as a closer, and kind of makes it a bit of a tease. Like, you think you're gonna be getting this giant 23-minute thing, and it's not. I've never liked it when albums do that hidden track thing, and this is maybe one of the worst examples I've ever seen of it. The silence is just so long, and the hidden track just so not worth the effort of fast-forwarding to. But I guess, like, you can ignore that. So, that's LP5. It's a pretty damn solid album. In one breath, I can totally understand if this is just where Autechre fall off for you into that weird experimental territory they more or less stayed in for the rest of their existence. I personally don't think they'd go totally off the deep end until their next two albums, but we'll get to those. And even if this album still has present melodies and beats that still bang, it's not exactly the most personally fulfilling IDM release I've ever heard. As I've said before, not only is the production on the tinny side the whole way through, makes the whole project feel kind of thinner than it needed to be, the rhythms and melodies are also just abstract enough to not form the kinds of patterns that can ever stick in my head. It's not a perfect album by any stretch, but by the same token, I've also seen other people holding this one up as Autechre's best album overall, and I can see that too. It's certainly one of their most consistent. It's one of their best from like a pacing standpoint too, with how it starts strong and ends strong, has a bunch of big standouts like right in the middle too. I don't know. For me, this one's like right about equal with Amber. Even if I feel like that one has better standouts and obviously more nostalgia factor than this one, LP5 just comes together as a whole a lot better and is like a more unique experience. It's not an immediate listen, certainly wasn't for me at least, but it is one that's slowly grown on me more and more as I've spent more time with it. It's Autechre in weird abstract mode, sure, but I feel like I still get it. It's still weird and abstract in an approachable way that isn't too far over the top. Obviously very conflicted about this one, but I think I'll settle with giving this the same rating that I gave Amber. Just a hair short of true greatness for me, but still definitely recommended. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.